Welcome everyone to the first session of the Spotlight's Let's Talk Online Talk series. And this is the first of 9 sessions. And we're happy to have you here today and hopefully in the next few weeks too. And we're very excited to welcome a guest speaker today, Michael O'Rourke, who together with his team has built something important for the collaborative research community, I would say, to promote inter and transdisciplinarity and dialogue in the US and also beyond. And I'll say more about our guest in a minute. But first, this online talk series is organized by the Berlin University Alliance and the Stifterverband in cooperation with the Global ITD Alliance and the German Society for Transdisciplinary and Participatory Research, GTPF. My name is Josefa Knie and I have the pleasure of moderating today's session. My colleague Isabel will support me with a chat if necessary. And we have 1 hour to, at first, hear a short input of 10 to 15 minutes, followed by me asking some follow-up questions, shedding more light also on the broader context of supporting collaboration between science and society. And then we'll have about 20 minutes of interactive discussion with you all. So feel free to use the chat whenever a question or thought pops into your mind. And very important, we would like to record this session for those who can't participate today. So please make sure to agree to the recording. And if you could switch on your camera to foster a little sense of community, that would also be lovely. And before we start, I would like to know, how international are we today? So please write in the chat, where are you dialing in from today? To begin with, a few words on how we got here in the first place. So this series of events we are kicking off today was initiated by the Laboratory for Transdisciplinary Research at the Berlin University Alliance, which is a partnership that comprises 3 major universities and the Medical University in Berlin. And the TD Lab is an infrastructure shared by all these 4 institutions, designed to support research in transdisciplinary research by offering professional development opportunities, financial grants, but also providing concrete guidance on drafting grant proposals. And it also takes a creative approach, developing its own formats for co-exploring socially relevant research topics, bringing together scientific and non-scientific experts. And today we have Nadine and Zorka here, who are responsible for the Spotlight project. So yes, thanks for waving. And also the rest of the TD Lab team, or most of them, are here. So yes, please show yourselves. And a few words on how the TD Lab understands transdisciplinarity, that is as a distinct research mode in which scientific knowledge is linked with specialized and everyday knowledge. So from that view, transdisciplinary research is also much more than mere participation, but it generates knowledge that is both scientifically sound and socially relevant. And today, or not today, but now, the TD Lab is 5 years old. And alongside with a lot of mind-expanding experiences in the TD Lab, it continues also to face challenges such as justifying transdisciplinary research to academic leaders, such as securing long-term funding for the necessary structures to support transdisciplinary research, because in particular in Germany, such structures are often established and funded more on a project-to-project basis without a long-term perspective. And so valuable experiences, quality standards, networks, and knowledge about successful forms of transdisciplinary collaboration can be quickly lost again. So this led the TD Lab team to ask, okay, so how are these challenges actually addressed in other countries, and how do transdisciplinary research support structures work in other countries? And this is what we want to put in the center in this series. So we invite people who are also committed to promote collaboration between science and societal actors who maybe presumably face similar questions as well. So the first person we want to ask about these topics is you, Michael. A few words about you. You are a professor of philosophy and part of the faculty in ag bio research and environmental science and policy at Michigan State University in the US. So you can see on the map where the US is located if somebody was wondering. And you're also the director of the Toolbox Dialogue Initiative, which is a research consortium that helps teams to build collaborative capacity. And you're also the executive director of the Toolbox Dialogue Initiative Center, which is a service center at Michigan State that is the principal locus of the Toolbox work. So yeah, I think, Michael, you and the Toolbox Dialogue Initiative Center have built something very special, with being like a center entirely dedicated to studying, to improving, to supporting the process of collaboration between academic disciplines and also beyond academia. And I don't want to say much more about you and your work at the Toolbox Dialogue Initiative and the center, but I would like to hand over to you, Michael, to take us on a journey into your work and to the Toolbox Dialogue Initiative. So the floor is yours, and I'm stopping the sharing, and you can share.
Thank you, Yusufa. Let me see, get my screen up. I hope everyone can see that.
Yes.
So hello, everybody, and thank you very much for taking time out of your day for this. My role today is to talk about the Toolbox Dialogue Initiative. As Yusufa mentioned, I'm Executive Director of the Toolbox Dialogue Initiative Center at MSU, and the Director of the Toolbox Dialogue Initiative, which is a different thing, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. Generally, I think of myself as a philosopher who spends quite a lot of time thinking about interdisciplinarity or cross-disciplinarity, and an interdisciplinarian who engages with projects philosophically. So it's kind of a summary of how I think of myself and identify myself as a professional. Much of my work these days is focused on the Toolbox Dialogue Initiative. Actually, probably over the last 20 years, I've really focused primarily on enhancing collaborative capacity through toolbox-related activities. The Toolbox Dialogue Initiative is a facilitation and research group that's based at Michigan State University in the United States. We facilitate collaborative capacity with partners around the world, and we also investigate the practice of collaborative cross-disciplinary research. And these two things are in contact with one another. In fact, they form a feedback loop that sort of drives the Toolbox Dialogue Initiative, or TDI as we call it. We facilitate workshops, again, for partners around the world. Often we collect data. When we facilitate those workshops, those data are fed into our research, and we study the impact of the Toolbox Dialogue Toolbox Dialogue method, which is a sort of narrow focus, but also more broadly, we're interested in aspects of cross-disciplinary research, including things like dialogue and integration. And what we learn through our research efforts, we feed back into our workshops. So we try our best to make sure our facilitation efforts are informed by what we know about cross-disciplinary research. We got our start back in 2005 at the University of Idaho in a National Science Foundation funded integrative graduate education and research traineeship project. This is a program at NSF, the IGRT program, that was focused on changing the culture of interdisciplinary research in the US. And in particular, they wanted to provide graduate students with the opportunity to become interdisciplinary at an earlier point in their career. And the University of Idaho had a project funded by that program. And in the project, the students struggled a bit to do the integrative work that was necessary to achieve interdisciplinary objectives. And the Toolbox Dialogue method was really born out of the frustration of these graduate students. I had an opportunity to team teach a PhD seminar, and together with the students and other faculty, we designed the Toolbox Dialogue method, which was subsequently described in an article published in Bioscience. And we were funded right around the same time by National Science Foundation to explore the method. Over time, we expanded. We moved to Michigan State in 2012. We've been funded by National Science Foundation almost continually since 2008. We're also funded by NASA and others. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. Right now, the Toolbox Dialogue Initiative, as Josefa mentioned, is a diverse community of researchers that really forms a consortium that's distributed across the United States. And in 2021, we founded at MSU the Toolbox Dialogue Initiative Center, which is the hub of the work that we do. So these are people who are focused as kind of through their careers on advancing Toolbox Dialogue Initiative work. And those people are in front of you right now. I have the honor and privilege of working with three associate directors at TDI Center, Dr. Edgar Cardenas, Dr. Mirza Irinkis, and Dr. Chet McCluskey. And Beth McGavro is our project manager. So this is the five of us are, along with a number of graduate students and others who are doing most of the toolbox work that gets done these days. Now, the focus of our efforts, again, is sort of cross-disciplinary broadly. We do a lot of work with interdisciplinary partners. We also do a lot of work with transdisciplinary partners that include members from sectors outside of the academy. In these types of groups, as I suspect perhaps all of you know, collaborators come from different locations. If they're in an interdisciplinary group, they may come from just a variety of different disciplines. If they're a transdisciplinary group, there might be disciplinary heterogeneity alongside, partners from sectors outside of the academy. Collaborators in heterogeneous groups like these can struggle to communicate because they're trained to understand the problems they're engaging with differently. We take the root of this challenge to be what we call the problem of unacknowledged differences. So let's say you're a member of one of these groups. You know you're different from the other folks that you're working with, but you don't necessarily know how, right? You're trained to be an expert in your particular profession, in your particular discipline. But with that training does not come typically information about how your expertise differs from the expertise of others. Furthermore, in these projects where we're working together and hoping to achieve something something amazing as a collective, we tend to assume we're more alike than we really are. We are kind of fall prey to social psychological biases like the false consensus bias that might incline us to see more similarity than there really is. The Toolbox Dialogue Initiative's mission, then, is expressed by this conditional. If unacknowledged differences in language, belief, and value compromise cross-disciplinary research and practice, then it seems to us, at least, like a good step forward would be to acknowledge those differences and coordinate across them so that you can enhance mutual understanding, communication, and collaborative capacity. And that's what we do. The Toolbox Dialogue Initiative is really focused on using dialogue-based workshops and related activities to enhance communication and collaboration in these complex research and practice environments. The dialogue-based activities are kind of informed fundamentally by what we've come to call the Toolbox Dialogue method, which has two parts that are realized in a typical Toolbox Dialogue workshop. The first part is a structured dialogue that's designed to reveal attitudes, beliefs, and values, these unacknowledged differences in a heterogeneous group. By the way, it's not just unacknowledged differences that matter, it's also unacknowledged similarities. We tend to emphasize the differences, but the more you learn about one another in these heterogeneous groups, the more you have available to you to leverage in creating a whole that's greater than the sum of the parts. The second part of the Toolbox Dialogue method is a co-creation activity that's built for purpose to leverage what's learned in the dialogue for that particular group. The Toolbox Dialogue method, and especially the structured dialogue part, is structured by what we call a Toolbox instrument. So the Toolbox instrument is a survey-like instrument that includes prompts which get at unacknowledged research commitments. These prompts are sorted into thematic modules. In front of you, you see one module entitled Interdisciplinarity in the Academy. We have maybe hundreds of modules at this point, covering topics like methodology, values and objectivity, data sharing, and others. It's important to understand that the prompts in these modules in the Toolbox instrument are written to suggest topics for discussion and to promote dialogue. I describe this as a survey-like instrument. It's not a survey instrument. These are not psychometrically validated survey items. They're written with a view to pushing people to respond, perhaps even strongly, about core beliefs and core values that they have as members of these partner groups. Here's an example exchange. Again, we've worked with interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary groups, cross-disciplinary groups, really across the spectrum. This is from a dialogue, a workshop with an interdisciplinary group, and this exchange involved an ecologist and an economist talking about the prompt, scientific research must be hypothesis-driven. And if you take this is just a tiny part of an exchange in which the two of them are talking about how they use hypotheses in their work. And the ecologist in this particular exchange is somewhat dubious about how the economist uses hypotheses. And the context within which this takes place, it becomes clear that the ecologist thinks that science begins once you have a hypothesis to test. All the work that's done to get to the hypothesis really doesn't qualify as science from the perspective of the ecologist, this particular ecologist anyway. These are the kinds of exchanges that take place in Toolbox Dialogues that help individuals kind of like recognize where they stand with respect to one another concerning core aspects of their particular practice. Now, so we're a facilitation group and a research group. As facilitators, we try to meet our partners where they're at. So we gather information about them, develop a Toolbox instrument for them, in particular, a sui generis instrument for the group we're working with, which we use to structure dialogue in a workshop. We'll collect data often, and those data will inform a report that we return to the group. And the group then is invited to reflect on that report. And if we are working with a partner over a long period of time, we'll repeat this cycle. So after reflection and incorporation of the insights they gain, we'll come back later and do the same thing again. That can help, for instance, if there's project turnover or if the project has different work packages that are sequentially arranged. At this point, we've conducted more than 600 workshops around the world with many partners. So we've worked with, again, the European Commission, many universities in the United States and abroad and elsewhere around the world. The primary partners these days are the National Science Foundation and NASA. Our work with these two agencies in the United States has focused on providing Toolbox Dialogue workshops for 5 different programs. We're founding partners with 4 programs at National Science Foundation and 1 at NASA. All of the awardees that those programs fund participate in Toolbox workshops. They partner with us and go through the workshops that we run. And our funding flows primarily from grants and contracts set up through the various partners that we work with. So sometimes our Our work is funded as research. Sometimes it's funded primarily as facilitation through a contract type mechanism. We're pretty flexible when it comes to the way in which we engage with partners to help them develop their collaborative capacity. As researchers, we are focused primarily on evaluating workshop effectiveness. We'll do collect data in many of our workshops, and this data again inform a report. That report is a research-based report designed to describe and discuss the effectiveness of the particular workshop we facilitated with a group. But more broadly, we're interested in the impact of Toolbox Dialogue across groups. So we'll try to aggregate many of these workshops with a view to identify patterns of success, patterns of failure across Toolbox workshops. And then most broadly, we're interested in how dialogue type interventions of the Toolbox sort can serve as a lens on cross-disciplinary process more generally. And so we've published quite a bit on integration and on communication in cross-disciplinary projects. And much of this work has been published in the peer-reviewed literature. We have a book that we produced a few years ago. We've also been evaluated independently by various groups, in particular the Western Michigan University Evaluation Center. So this is all really a way of thinking about how we tried to disseminate the impact of the Toolbox workshop beyond just the Toolbox Dialogue experiences that we provide for our partners. With that, I will stop. And I think it's now the Josefa's turn. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Michael. Thank you for the very short but insightful, nevertheless, presentation of your work. And I imagine there's a lot of applause, and there are also probably many questions on your approach and your work at the Toolbox Dialogue Initiative and the Center. But maybe let us zoom out for a few minutes, because you also, we've seen where in the world you have conducted workshops, etc. And you have used this term of that people have a false consensus about what is different or similar. And in one of our previous conversations, I realized that we have, or I share with people in, I don't know, Germany, Europe, maybe the false consensus that transdisciplinarity is a term that is really used and prominent, which isn't the case in the US, as you told me. So talking about transdisciplinary research, and you are familiar with the term, using it, but you're also using cross-disciplinarity, for example. So how would you describe the stand of transdisciplinary research or other terms used for it in the US? How would you describe the field and the scene there at the moment?
Now, I'll say two things. One, and this is from my perspective as a practitioner in the US. I think that things are changing, and the European conception of transdisciplinarity, the one that involves collaboration between typically academic partners and partners from outside the academy, that particular way of thinking about what qualifies as transdisciplinarity is gaining more traction in the US these days. But I think the term transdisciplinarity, as it's been used in the US, was driven to a pretty great extent by work funded through the National Institutes of Health around the turn of the century, work that is associated with people like Dan Stokols and Carol Hall and others who came to be associated with the science of team science community. And a lot of that work used, like for instance, there was a program called the TTURC program, which was the Transdisciplinary Tobacco Use Research Centers, which was a program NIH funded in the US. And there, transdisciplinarity as a term was used to describe the creation of new disciplines. So what you might think of as transformative interdisciplinarity, right? Interdisciplinarity that ultimately led to the creation of some brand new discipline. And that's obviously not the conception, I think, of transdisciplinarity that's dominant in Europe and becoming more dominant in the United States. In the US, though, it's not as if people aren't working with partners. It's not as if academics aren't working with partners from outside of the academy. That kind of work goes by different names. And so there's a lot of community engaged work, participatory action research type work that gets done in academic contexts that I think would qualify under the broad banner of transdisciplinarity. It's a sort of European banner of transdisciplinarity. There's been an emphasis within National Science Foundation on convergence research and convergence as NSF funds conceives of it. There's no, for what it's worth, there's no uniform conception of convergence even in NSF, but the NSF ways of thinking about convergence align with transdisciplinarity. And so, and also possibly, I mean, you could argue, I think, that translational research of the sort that the National Institutes of Health fund also looks a lot like, at least in many of its manifestations, a lot like transdisciplinarity. So, long answer, but I think we're doing it. We're doing this kind of work in the U.S., but it's going by different names. Although I think I feel like there's more and more uses of the term in a way that aligns with how Europeans have been using it. And the other point I want to make just real quick is that I really think this sort of thing matters a lot. People sometimes, there's a prominent criticism of semantic concerns like this in a Nature paper published in 2015. There's a special section on interdisciplinarity that described worrying about semantic issues as faintly theological hair splitting, which still irks me. But my personal opinion is that paying attention to semantic differences actually makes a big difference in helping institutions and individuals kind of organize their efforts and mobilize their efforts. So worrying about stuff like this strikes me as a valuable use of our time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I am a philosopher, though, so keep that in mind. That I might be a little bit biased.
Yeah, but I mean, if it helps understanding each other, it also helps
Yeah,
putting
there you
things
go.
together. So I think big, very essential quality. Yes, and I thought like one thing I found very interesting because I'm not so familiar with the US context, and you said that all the universities having a state in their name, so the state universities have also like a genuinely transdisciplinary mission, working together with the
Oh
region
yeah,
which
yeah,
they
yeah.
are, and also working together, especially with the agriculture or the topic of agriculture. So that's also like very inherent transdisciplinarity happening there. That
No, I think that's right. So the in the U.S. there are what are known as land grant universities, and many, but not all, but many of these universities are, as you point out, are the X state universities in a given state. Like Michigan State University is the land grant in Michigan. University of Michigan isn't. It's not, again, there are exceptions, like University of Idaho was a land grant university in Idaho, but most of the states, the state university would be the land grant. And land grant universities were founded with the view to providing research-based information, research-based solutions to people in the state that typically the state or the region, maybe more broadly, that they operate in. So, and that, that's, it feels in various at various points like transdisciplinarity. It can also just be like, here's what the researchers learned, do with it what you will kind of thing, like just providing research-based information without too much transdisciplinary partnership. But I think more and more of that kind of work, the transdisciplinary work is being conducted by these universities, yes.
Yeah, thank you. I definitely could ask more, but I would like to open up the discussion to the rest of the room now. Maybe if you have a question, you can raise your hand directly. You can put your thought or question in the chat, whatever suits you best. But feel free to, get into the conversation now. So there was a hand by Annette.
Yeah, so thank you for your input. And I'm very interested in your approach in measuring these differences in perceptions and even in languages, because we work at these crossroads as well. We work a lot with cities and universities, and we do a lot of workshops with multiple stakeholders from extremely different backgrounds. And the question I would like to ask is, your concept is designed to do research. This is what you say, but there are others in these processes and dialogues who are not as interested in the research, but in an innovation that is being designed together with research partners. And my experience with cities, with municipalities or regional stakeholders is, not even speaking about civil society, but if research comes with their methodology, enters the room in first starting to measure, to make it like in a lab situation, to quantify, they feel intimidated. So it's not creating trust if we begin with our academic methodologies, while for us as researchers from the academic field, we feel at home and we feel even safe in this environment because it helps us to organize and structure. But for others, they feel very unsafe in this environment because they feel inferior, because it's like forcing them to act like in a lab-like setting. So my question would be, how do you work with stakeholders with non-academic backgrounds? That's the first. And the second, what do you do if you realize that the expectations and languages are really utterly different, which I think you all see definitely in the US, but also in Germany, where you will see, well, we are just not compatible.
No, that's a great question. What we typically do when we launch a partnership, like for instance, a transdisciplinary partnership, is somebody will approach us with an interest in working with us, and they'll describe the situation, and in that initial intake conversation, also early conversations as we build the partnership, we'll discuss the question of research, and our goal would be in those circumstances to conduct transdisciplinary research according to best practices associated with it. And so we'd want to do shoulder-to-shoulder research with our community partners or partners, being full-fledged researchers from start to finish. And so that, which is, a heavy lift for a lot of people, and not something that many people are going to derive much value from, right? It's not as if they're going to get credit on their jobs for participating as research partners in a project like this. And so we'll make a decision early in the process about whether whether this particular partnership will involve research or not. And we're not driven by the desire to do it, right? We're not going to be saying, well, you don't want to be research partners with us, so we're just going to pass on this project, right? Instead, research isn't like a condition on participation that we impose. But if they're interested in what research can provide, then that would drive a kind of research collaboration. Otherwise, if they're not, and you bring up a good reason why many of our partners are not interested in research. If they're not, then we won't. So that's a decision that happens early on, and it's not uncommon that we pursue, especially transdisciplinary partnerships, without collecting research data. So again, for the reasons you point out, right? We're not interested. We're interested in creating conversations that are going to be beneficial for the partners, and if the partners if the partners are of the opinion that conversations where data are being collected for research purposes would be conversations that won't be open for various reasons, then we won't do it. We have done a few. We have conducted a few projects, transdisciplinary projects that have involved research and data collection, that sort of thing. We worked with the city of Grand Rapids, Michigan, on a climate resilience project that generated work we published in Ecology and Society a few years ago. I'll put a link to that in the chat if you're interested. And that involved doing a lot of preparatory work before we ever sat down with the groups. We did mental modeling. We had sort of informational workshops about climate change, climate adaptation, mitigation, with various sectors in Grand Rapids. So like the HVAC sector, built environment, we had about 10 of these workshops, collected data in those workshops, and then conducted mental modeling interviews with key informants representing these different communities. Those data fed into the development of the instruments that we used in our toolbox workshops. And then data were collected out of those and so forth. But so not all of our transdisciplinary partners have passed on the research. Some have embraced it because they thought that this is an important, not only it's important for us because we want to continue to do this in the future. And so we want to learn from the experience in this iteration so that we can improve it the next time we do it. So that was one of the motivations behind data collection in that case. But I think you raised a very, very important point. And our strategy has just been to be sensitive to the needs of our partners. Whatever they get to drive the decisions we make about this.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks for your answer. We have 5 more questions so far, so and like 20 more minutes left. So
okay,
shorten your answers a little bit. So next question would be, who were the biggest supporters and also the biggest critics of your project?
Early on, I think that it was the same group, and that was so early on. As I mentioned, we were funded by National Science Foundation, and that meant for the first 4 or 5 years, we conducted a lot of free workshops. We didn't charge anybody for workshops, and we were just trying to figure out what we had, and when it worked, when it didn't work, what were the conditions for possible success. But we encountered a lot of faculty members, a lot of interdisciplinary researchers who were pleased to make our acquaintance. A number of them reacted, "Where have you been?" Right? We've needed this for a long time, right? But then there were also others who reacted to our workshops by saying, well, our workshops are like 2 to 3 hours long, so they're not that long, right? At least I don't think they're that long. But we encountered faculty and other researchers who would say, "Oh, I don't have 2 hours for that." It's like, well, how about in 6 months? I mean, we could schedule this out, "Oh, I don't have 2 hours in 6 months." It's like, oh, okay, I understand. You will never have 2 hours for this. And so, yeah, so there were faculty some were really excited about the opportunity to do this, and others were just not convinced. That they just wanted, look, if I have 2 hours, I want to use it on the research, right? They didn't think team building, mutual understanding. They weren't convinced that developing this sort of relational infrastructure of projects like that was going to be a valuable use of their time. I think, yeah, as far as downstream critics, we haven't really been in receipt of too much research-based criticism. So there hasn't been too much published critique of the Toolbox Dialogue method. I would love to see it. And honestly, I think it would be really great for us to have a chance to engage with critics about it. It's certainly true that Toolbox Dialogue workshops don't always work. I mean, I worked with a colleague, Dina Pham from Australia, developing a book on inter and transdisciplinary failures a few years ago. And Toolbox has a chapter in that book that describes a number of our failed workshops and what we learned from the failures, right? So it's like, these don't, somebody, like for instance, if somebody gets cut off in traffic on their way to the workshop and they get irritated, and they bring that irritation with them into the dialogue and they let it sort of spill out over their colleagues, it can wreck a workshop. Right? It just, because we're dependent upon the participants to lean into the experience. And if they're not willing to do that, then it could very well be a waste of time. So we just, anyway. Yeah, I should maybe move on to the next one.
Yeah, there's a question that lines up perfectly because Chantal has asked, do you also encounter science skeptical or anti-democratic actors in your project? And if yes, how to deal with them? So maybe to make it concrete.
I'm thinking about the Grand Rapids project that I mentioned, and there definitely there was a range of attitudes about climate change exhibited by people who were involved in that project. It was a very large project if you include all the folks who contributed. Definitely people who were skeptical about climate change and about scientific consensus. We've probably one bit of pressure that helps us is that we will typically work with projects that are formed independently of us. So we're brought in to enhance the collaborative capacity of a particular partner group that has its own sort of independent reason for existing. If there are science skeptical or anti-democratic actors who are already a part of that group, and that's that's a problem for them, or maybe it's not a problem for them, then the whatever sort of integrative efforts are necessary to kind of encourage them to be contributing collaborators in that project, that's clearly going to be a priority for that project. Again, entirely independently of us, right? I mean, if science skepticism or sort of anti-democratic attitudes are a problem, it's going to be a problem for them. And so when we're brought in, typically those kinds of issues are issues that won't affect our collaboration with them, unless, of course, it's some of these attitudes are disclosed in the process of the dialogue itself. And then in those contexts, we have ground rules that norm the dialogues, and our facilitation style is pretty light-handed because we want the dialogue to be the group's dialogue and not ours. But in those moments, if something is disclosed that seems potentially damaging, we'll engage as facilitators more, in a kind of a bigger way to make sure that particular moment in the dialogue doesn't have a damaging effect on the workshop as a whole and on the team or the partner group primarily. So that has not happened. There's maybe 2 times that I can remember where something like that happened. It's a great question, but because we're working with partners that have an independent existence, we tend to be able to take advantage of their interest in being a good collaboration, and that interest tends to motivate them to lean into the experience.
Thank you. I will suggest to ask to answer Anna's question maybe because it's also directed to
Yeah.
Toolbox work. If you could say more about doing these workshops with grad students, so in the educational environment, so to say.
Yeah. So yeah, we started again. We grew out of a graduate training program, our project at University of Idaho, and I probably if there's one group of one sort of demographic category that we worked with the most, it might be graduate student groups over time. We've done a lot of workshops across the country and even internationally with graduate student groups that many of these workshops have been conducted in the context of interdisciplinary training projects or even transdisciplinary training projects. We published recently a couple of papers that were grounded in work we did in Eastern Africa with partners funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation. And that project, which is called the Witty Weeds Project, focused on pulling together graduate students teams to do work designed to develop ultimately sustainable management plans for woody invasive plants in Kenya, Ethiopia, and Tanzania. And so those that we ran workshops every 8 months or so with the graduate student groups and the faculty supervisors that with that project. So we've done, again, a wide variety of different groups with workshops with graduate students. I think one thing that just there's a lot to say, but maybe one point that might be worth mentioning is that I think one thing we've learned is that you need to be thoughtful about power when you run workshops with graduate students, especially graduate students who are part of bigger projects. If it's a graduate training program at a university, like a degree program, that's one thing. Typically, it's just graduate students, and you don't have to worry as much about power. But if you're in a project like this one I mentioned in Eastern Africa, where you've got supervisors and graduate students, then you need to be thoughtful about how you arrange, about first of all, who you're working with, and then how you arrange the workshops to make sure that the graduate students are featured and not backgrounded. Sometimes we've had this happen before we were thoughtful about this, where the graduate students would just stay quiet because they didn't want to say anything that might get them sideways with their supervisors, or the supervisors would just go on and on and on and on and on and not make room for those graduate students. So anyway, yeah, that's one point that we've had to put in focus when we work with graduate students. And the second part about that question, I would say, yeah, I think the fact that we're founding partners with 4 programs at National Science Foundation and a program at NASA reflects the expansion of interest in the science of team science, at least within the funding agencies in the United States. It's not the case that every program that funds teams is interested in providing science-based team science support for their teams, but many are, and the list is slowly growing. So I take that to be an indication that the science of team science is moving out beyond NIH.
Okay, then maybe a big question from Zorka and a short answer, if possible, from your side. Given today's political climate in the US, but also across Europe, what decisions or alliances are needed to protect and sustain your work? And also the other way around, so to say, which responsibilities do you see infrastructures like yours and ours, TD Lab, having towards science and society in political times like these? So that's like a big question to answer at the end for.
Yeah, it's so important. It's a great question, and both sides of it are uh, challenging. So I'll do my best. Something happened January 2025 that you might remember that changed everything for us. Like our funding was primary. We exist, the Toolbox Dialogue Initiative Center, because we have these federal partners in the United States who are interested in, enhancing the prospects for the teams they fund. But that moment, January 20th, 2025, literally that day, there were things that were signed that had just a chilling effect on decision making in the science funding bodies in the U.S. And so we've scrambled. We anticipated this. I mean, we've been around this block a few times between 2016 and 2020, but we didn't really anticipate it. It happened so fast and so furiously that we just didn't. We were kind of put back on our heels, and so we've spent pretty much the whole time since then building out new relationships, like seeking, like you put it, new alliances that can protect and sustain our work. So, for example, we've spent quite a bit of time trying to cultivate relationships with philanthropies, with philanthropic, and a number of these philanthropic organizations see themselves as occupying a particular niche that can provide some relief for science funding in these very uncertain times. Not that philanthropies don't have the kind of budgets that NIH has or NSF even has for this sort of work, but there are niches that they occupy that allow them to kind of provide some relief. So, it's philanthropies have maybe been a little bit more open to conversation with us, but if somebody's going to fund your work, they're going to need to be convinced that that's money well spent. And in our case, and I don't think this is necessarily different from anybody else's case, but in our case, that means building a relationship with them, and that takes time. And so we've had to spend quite a lot of time writing emails and setting in meetings and, just doing all the stuff you do to build relationships with hopefully potential partners. But we find ourselves kind of in this sort of existential moment where at some point somebody needs to say, okay, let's give it a shot. we'll give you some money and see what you do for us, right? And if somebody doesn't do that soon, then we might find. I mean, we're in a precarious situation right now. So that's the first part of your question. The second part of your question, I think I am a big believer, as you might expect, in the power of dialogue to make a difference in contexts where people have different core beliefs and core values. One thing that I had mentioned before we rely on in our workshops is the sort of centripetal force of an independently existing research project that pulls them together and keeps them together, and that makes it possible for them to participate in this sort of collective way, in this engaged way, in the Toolbox workshop for typical research projects. But if you were to run a Toolbox workshop for, say, a community in Colorado, just a politically focused one, that for a community in Colorado, you aren't in a position these days to rely on that sort of cohesion, right? You can't assume that the people who participate in it really care about one another, even, right? And so there are some structural aspects of the current political moment that make the kinds of things we do tricky. But for what it's worth, we are spending time thinking about how to expand our footprint so as to make some kind of difference in this context. We haven't really done anything yet, but we're in couple of conversations that hopefully in the next year will put us in a position to facilitate dialogues that have a salutary impact on the political climate in the US, at least. I mean, I feel like we have to do that. It's like our civic responsibility.
Thanks for these last words. I thank you very much. I think this hour went over in a second for me. There are a lot of questions left on my list, and I think on other lists as well. I wanted to ask you a final question, but I think you've already given the answer now. I wanted to ask you what the one thing is that other support structures or structures supporting transdisciplinary research could learn from you, and I think you would say it's to believe in the power of dialogue. So I framed that as your last word and answer. And want to thank you very much for taking us on the journey into the Toolbox Dialogue, the Toolbox Dialogue Initiative as such, but also into the broader context of the US. And yeah, also thanks again for the TD Lab.
You're welcome.
The series possible, and I want to say 30 seconds more about what's happening next. So next, whoa, sorry, now I'm lost in my screens. Next week, we have on June 17th, really early in the morning in Europe or in Central European summertime. It's 8 a.m., but I think it's worth, especially for the ones interested in how transdisciplinary research is also really integrated into regions and into cities, into politics as well. So Penny Hagen and Eroini Hawk from the Auckland Co-Design Lab will be here and giving us an insight in how they are working also with indigenous knowledge systems, which will be super interesting. And yes, so please make sure to set your alarm clocks early or late, wherever you are. And don't forget to register for the next week and also the following up conversations. And yes, thank you, Michael, for being here.
Thank you, Josefa. Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate the honor of participating in this series. Thank you.
Thank you.